Chapter 1. The clock that rang only once. It was the sort of grey and listless London morning that settled heavily upon the shoulders, muffling even the clip-clop of passing cabs on Baker Street. I had just returned from an early appointment at the Royal Free Hospital and found Holmes at his usual post, lounging in his armchair with one slippered foot hooked over the other, his eyes half shut and a wisp of smoke curling lazily from the bowl of his pipe. The fire was burning low, and the rain tapped idly at the windows. Nothing in the room suggested motion, urgency, or mystery until, without shifting his position, Holmes remarked, "You are troubled, Watson." I paused in the doorway. "Only by the weather," I replied, removing my overcoat, "and by the peculiar silence that seems to have taken hold of the day." "A silence," said Holmes, now opening one eye, "which will soon be broken. There is a footfall on the stair, deliberate and uncertain. Someone has hesitated twice before knocking. A nervous client, and one carrying something fragile, I should say." Even before he finished speaking, a hesitant rap sounded on the door, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice and the soft creak of our guest entering. The man who stood there was in his late 40s, gaunt and pale, with a high forehead and eyes that flitted about the room as though afraid of settling on anything too long. In his gloved hands he held a cloth-wrapped object, gripped as tenderly as a newborn. "I hope I am not intruding," he said in a voice clipped by anxiety. "My name is Felix Hargrove. I was advised to seek out Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "You have found him," Holmes said, gesturing to the seat opposite. "And you carry, I believe, the very reason for your visit. You may speak freely before Dr. Watson." Hargrove sat with the stiffness of a man who has endured a long vigil. "It is my sister, Mr. Holmes. Agatha was found dead 3 nights ago, seated beside the long case clock in the vestibule of our family home near Belgravia. It struck midnight only once that evening and never again." Holmes raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I am aware that the matter appears unremarkable on the surface. Scotland Yard has already declared it death by natural causes. Her heart, they said, simply gave out. But there is something wrong, sir. I knew Agatha better than anyone. She was in robust health, and the clock, that blasted clock, it never fails to chime. Yet that night it rang only once, and it was exactly at the moment she died." "You are suggesting," Holmes said slowly, "that the timepiece bore witness to something more than mechanics." "I don't know what I'm suggesting," Hargrove said, gripping the wrapped object tighter. "Only that something about her death doesn't sit right. And then yesterday I found this on her writing desk." He slowly unwrapped the bundle, revealing a curious item, a small brass bell, delicately wrought, but with one side darkened as if scorched. Holmes leaned forward, taking it between his fingers. "Not ornamental," he murmured. "Functional. Likely used for summoning a servant. But what is this, Berna? Wait." Watson observed the lip here. "It's melted. Intense heat applied quickly." "I found it in her drawer," Hargrove said. "Agatha would never have hidden something like that unless she feared what it meant." Holmes turned the bell over thoughtfully. "This belonged to the house." "No, I've never seen it before." "Nor had the staff. Agatha was. She had a habit of keeping strange things. Clocks, metronomes, antique barometers. She said their ticking helped her think." "I shall come at once," Holmes said, standing abruptly. The coincidence of the clock and the timing of her death, combined with a foreign artifact showing signs of unusual damage. No, Mr. Hargrove, this is no ordinary demise. Watson, your coat. As we descended the stairs and hailed a cab, I asked, "What is it that struck you about the case, Holmes?" "Two things," he replied, eyes narrowed. "The first is the chime that rang only once. The second, Mr. Hargrove never mentioned at what hour his sister died. And yet I knew it was midnight." I blinked. "But he did say no, Watson. He said only that the clock rang once and never again. He never stated the time of death. And yet I am quite certain it occurred precisely as the hand passed 12. Then you believe it was more than coincidence?" "On the contrary," Holmes said, his expression hardening, "I believe it was a message." And so began one of the strangest cases I ever had the misfortune to witness, where clocks told lies, silence screamed, and the key to the mystery lay not in what ticked, but in what stopped. Chapter 2. A house with too many clocks. Our hansom cab rattled through the sodden streets of London as Holmes sat in taut silence, his eyes fixed not on the misted window, but on the mechanism's worry in his mind. He cradled the scorched brass bell in his gloved hand, turning it idly with fingers that seemed to tap in rhythm with some invisible pendulum. I had long learned not to disturb him during such moments, though I could scarcely suppress the questions that itched at the back of my throat. "You are quiet, Holmes," I ventured at last, as we passed through the iron gates of Belgravia's more ancient quarter. "Do you truly believe Miss Hargrove's death to be unnatural?" "My dear Watson," he said, without looking at me, "any death accompanied by a silenced mechanism and a melted servant's bell is unnatural, if only by implication." "But surely such a coincidence—" "There is no such thing," he interrupted, "as coincidence. There are only patterns not yet discerned." We pulled up before a tall and narrow Georgian house, its brick facade weathered, ivy curling like veins around the windows. Mr. Hargrove was waiting at the door, his composure no less strained than earlier. He ushered us in without ceremony, and we stepped into a vestibule that carried a hush too complete to be comforting. The long case clock stood directly before us, looming in the dim hallway like a sentinel. It was of dark oak, intricately carved with celestial symbols, and its face bore not numbers but Roman characters so fine they seemed etched by hand. "She was found there," Hargrove said, pointing to a straight-backed chair beside the clock, seated as if waiting for something. "She had just returned from her walk and asked for tea. 10 minutes later, she was dead." Holmes crouched beside the chair, eyes flitting from the floorboards to the brass pendulum swaying behind the glass casing. He rose, circled the clock, and finally opened its rear panel with a flick of his fingers. "Do you keep the mechanism wound?" he asked. "Yes. It has been in the family for 3 generations. Agatha never let it lapse, not once." Holmes examined the gears and springs, his touch light and exacting. Then he shut the panel gently and walked the length of the corridor, stopping at each door to peer in. The hallway led to a drawing room on the left, a study to the right, and a narrow servant's staircase further down. The whole interior was modest but curated with a strange fastidiousness, barometers in each room, an excess of clocks, some ornate, some ordinary, but all functioning. Each ticked to its own rhythm, and the air was filled with an overlapping lattice of mechanical sound. "Your sister had a particular fondness for timekeeping, I gather, Holmes said. She said silence was a weight upon the soul, Hargrove replied. She liked the reassurance of things that ticked. And yet, Holmes murmured, pausing beside a marble mantel clock, she died in silence. We entered the study next. It was small, with curtained windows and shelves burdened with volumes on physics, astronomy, and antique engineering. A small writing desk stood in the corner, its blotter clean, but the drawers slightly ajar. Holmes bent over the lowest drawer, extracting a leather-bound ledger. He flipped through the pages, eyes darting. She was writing something, he said. See the indentations. But the pages are missing. Scotland Yard removed nothing, I asked. They barely looked, Hargrove answered bitterly. Inspector Gregson declared it a heart failure before he'd even removed his gloves. Holmes closed the book and sniffed at the interior of the drawer. Lavender, he said quietly, and something else metallic, possibly ozone. He turned to the fireplace, where a small pile of ash and scorched paper nestled beneath the grate. Using the poker, he shifted the gray clumps and extracted a half-burned scrap. On it was a single word, only partly legible. My nation. Holmes said nothing, but slipped the fragment into his notebook. Watson, he said, do you recall an article in the Times 6 months ago about the engineer who created a silent clock, one that marked time without sound? I do, I replied, but the invention was never released. The engineer died before finalizing the prototype. Suicide, I believe. Suicide, Holmes repeated, softly. Yes, or so it was said. We returned to the vestibule. Holmes stood again before the tall clock, arms folded. Felix, he said, using the man's first name for the first time. What of your household staff? There are 3, Hargrove answered. Mrs. Rundle, our cook, she's been here 20 years. A maid, Florence, and a groundsman who does not live in. Were they present that night? All but the groundsman. Holmes turned. I shall wish to speak with them separately. I shall send word, said Hargrove. May I ask, have you deduced anything? Holmes smiled faintly. Only that this case has less to do with the hour of death than with the manner in which time itself was disturbed. He then knelt once more before the grandfather clock. With utmost care, he reached into his coat and withdrew the scorched brass bell, opening the glass pane of the clock's face. He inserted the bell onto a small iron hook hidden inside the wooden frame. It fit perfectly. Holmes closed the pane and stepped back. What in heaven's name? I began. A replacement, Holmes said, but not one that belongs. It was removed after it served its purpose. Now we have restored it to its stage. Let us see who comes to collect it. Mr. Hargrove blanched. Someone entered the house. No, Holmes said, eyes cold. I believe someone never left. And with that chilling remark, we left the vestibule behind. The soft ticking of a dozen clocks following us like whispers through the walls. Chapter 3. The Servant's Isa. Hargrove residence had settled once more into an uneasy stillness when Holmes and I returned the following morning. A pale sun struggled through the Belgravia haze, casting long and uncertain shadows across the vestibule floor, where the tall clock now stood in its silent vigil. The brass bell restored within, Mr. Hargrove greeted us with more color in his cheeks and less tension in his voice. Their waiting in the parlor Mr. Holmes, Florence first. As you requested. Holmes nodded and proceeded to the room. A compact space, paneled in elm, with a faint trace of pipe smoke clinging to the drapes. Florence, the young maid, stood near the hearth, hands clasped and eyes downcast. She could not have been more than 20, with a complexion that suggested a life lived indoors, and a voice scarcely above a whisper. "You needn't be afraid, Miss Florence," Holmes said gently, as he took a seat. "We are not the police. I merely wish to know about the night your mistress died." "Yes, sir," she murmured. "You were the last to see her alive." I think so. I brought her tea around 11:30. She was in the vestibule, listening to the metronome on the mantel. She always said it helped her think." "And what did she say to you?" "Just, 'Thank you, Florence. That will be all.' She seemed calm, normal." "Did you hear the long case clock chime?" Florence hesitated. "Only once. It startled me, sir. I thought maybe it had stopped partway, but I was already in the kitchen when I noticed." "Did you return to the vestibule?" "No, sir. I heard Mr. Hargrove cry out just after midnight. That's when I ran in and saw her voice falter, saw her slumped in the chair." Holmes studied her with narrowed eyes. "Did your mistress receive any visitors that evening?" "No, sir. Not that I know of." He leaned forward slightly. "But she was expecting one, wasn't she?" Florence looked up, startled. How did you know?" "I didn't," Holmes said mildly. "But now I do." "Go on." Florence flushed, flustered. "It was nothing official. She'd received a letter in the Morning Post. No return address. She didn't open it in front of anyone, but after that she seemed thoughtful. She kept looking out the window that evening." Holmes folded his hands. "And you told no one?" "I didn't think it mattered, sir." "It matters very much," he replied. "Thank you, Florence. That will be all for now." As she left, Holmes turned to Hargrove. "I should like to examine the post your sister received in the days before her death. All of it. It's been bundled and kept in her desk," he said. "I'll have it brought." The door creaked again, and the second figure entered, Mrs. Rundle. The cook was as solid a woman as I had ever seen, her forearms broad, her expression neither hostile nor friendly. She sat when instructed, but kept her lips firmly together until Holmes broke the silence. "How long have you served the family, Mrs. Rundle?" 23 years, she said. "Saw Miss Agatha grow from child to woman. And in all those years, did you ever know her to suffer fainting spells or illness?" "Never," she said flatly. "Her nerves were better than mine." "You were in the kitchen that night, yes?" "Aye, and you heard the clock chime, just the once. Thought it was odd, but I wasn't about to go pokin' about." Holmes cocked his head. "Why not?" She hesitated. "Begging your pardon, but the house, it hasn't felt right lately." "Not since autumn." "In what way?" Mrs. Rundle shifted. "The clocks. She started ordering more one every few weeks. Some didn't even work. Others ticked out of sync. I swear, it got into my head after a while. That constant ticking, like bones being counted." Holmes didn't smile. "Did you ever see your mistress tamper with the long case clock?" "No, sir. That one she never touched. Said it was sacred to the family." "Sacred," I echoed. "She said it belonged to her grandmother, who was what you'd call a timekeeper. Had an obsession with celestial cycles and planetary alignments. Said that clock was built to keep true time." Holmes's brow furrowed. "True time." "Aye, not just hours and minutes. Something deeper. Said it could feel a disturbance in the rhythm of things, like a heart skipping a beat. We were silent a moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Rundle," Holmes said. "You've been most helpful." When the woman left, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, note what we've learned. 1. The chime rang only once, not because of mechanical failure, but because something interfered. 2. Miss Hargrove was expecting someone and had received an anonymous letter. And 3. The housekeeper confirms the deceased was of sound body and mind. Yet she died in the act of listening," I said, recalling Florence's comment. Holmes nodded slowly. "There is an odd tension in that. If death came in silence, what was she waiting to hear?" Before I could answer, Mr. Hargrove returned with a bundle of letters, each neatly stacked and tied with twine. Holmes sorted them swiftly, separating business correspondence, family invitations, and one peculiar envelope, plain, unmarked, and sealed with red wax. He held it to the light. "The seal is unbroken. No one noticed it before," Hargrove said. "It was caught beneath the drawer lining." Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the note. It contained but 5 words, written in a tidy, anonymous hand. "Time strikes only once, midnight." No signature, no date. Holmes stared at it a long while, then handed it to me. "So," I said, my voice low, "she was warned. She was invited." Holmes corrected. "This was no threat. It was a summons." We left the house an hour later, the ticking of clocks trailing behind us, like the fading echo of something that refused to be forgotten. Holmes paused on the front steps and glanced up at the sky. "One chime," he murmured. "That was all it took. And now we must ask, what, or who, did she meet at midnight?" Chapter 5. The shadow behind the alignment. It was nearing midnight again by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, and though the hour pressed upon us, sleep seemed a distant luxury. Holmes had taken his seat beneath the lamplight, the ledger from Greyweather's Guild spread open across his knees. The silence in the room was broken only by the scratch of his pencil and the occasional hiss of his pipe. "There is something here, Watson," he murmured, "something beyond murder. A design, perhaps, but whether spiritual, mechanical, or psychological, I cannot yet tell." I had been rereading the entry from the ledger. Next alignment due, 1:03 a.m. November 19th, but she died at midnight, I said, which means the chime was premature. Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, and that is the most telling detail of all. But who would possess the skill and the motive to manually trigger a sidereal chime 3 minutes early, let alone one so obscure?" "That," Holmes said, "is the very question that returns us to the suspect Scotland Yard believes it has already discarded." He reached into the drawer of his desk and retrieved a card. "Mr. Harwin Latchley, a former associate of the Hargrove family, some mild business dealings, and a known enthusiast of antique engineering. He was briefly questioned by Inspector Gregson on the night of Agatha's death. Dismissed without further consideration. Why? Because, Holmes said, he had what the Yard believed to be an unassailable alibi. He was at a gathering in Chelsea, attended by no fewer than 15 guests. But no one questioned how recently he had visited the Hargrove household, nor whether he possessed the knowledge required to tamper with such a clock." Holmes rose and paced slowly. "Latchley's interest in sidereal timing is no secret. He once wrote a letter to the quarterly horologist, arguing that traditional timekeeping was a shackled art and that true horology must attune itself to the deeper rhythms of the cosmos. He sounds more mystic than mechanic, I muttered. Holmes gave a thin smile, not unlike the late Elijah Broome. Do you think the two were acquainted? I intend to find out, he said, tapping ash from his pipe. Latchley has a workshop on Berwick Street. We shall visit him tomorrow. The next morning dawned pale and windless. The streets of Soho, always slightly askew from the rest of London's rhythms, seemed eerily quiet as we approached the narrow facade of Latchley's workshop. It was a strange little storefront, neither clock shop nor home its windows darkened with thick, amber-tinted glass. A chime rang overhead as we entered. The interior was dense with ticking and humming mechanisms. Clocks of every conceivable shape lined the walls, but it was not their uniformity that drew the eye, it was their chaos. Some moved backward, others ticked in irregular intervals. The air carried the scent of scorched brass and soldering smoke. At a desk in the rear, a tall man with angular features and a neatly trimmed beard looked up from a disassembled gear array. His pale eyes blinked once and then again before a smile spread across his face. "Mr. Holmes," he said calmly, "and Dr. Watson, I thought you might call." Holmes offered no surprise. "Then you anticipated my interest in the Hargrove matter." "I did," said Latchley, gesturing for us to sit. "I even set the clocks to the correct hour for your arrival." I glanced about nervously. "Correct hour. For you," he said, eyes glinting. "Not for the rest of the world." Holmes's expression remained unchanged. "Mr. Latchley, you were present at Miss Agatha Hargrove's funeral." "I was, but did not appear in the official register of visitors. I did not wish to be seen." "Why?" "Because," he said, folding his long fingers, "I was afraid someone might ask the very question you're now asking. Did you tamper with the long case clock at the Hargrove estate?" Latchley was silent for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Miss Hargrove summoned me a week before her death. She asked me to examine the gearing, said the chime was out of rhythm. I made only minor adjustments, nothing that should have activated the bell manually. But someone did," Holmes said. "And they did it to preempt a sidereal alignment by precisely 3 minutes." Latchley's face grew pale. "That would require knowledge of the internal compensator. Only 3 men alive know how to manipulate it." "2," Holmes corrected. "Elijah Broome is dead." Latchley stood, restless. "Broome's death. It wasn't simply a suicide. I've long suspected he was driven to madness by something he discovered in Avenel's journals. The man believed time was not merely measured, but shaped. Shaped by whom? I don't know," Latchley said, voice barely above a whisper. "But Broome once told me, there are hands beyond the dial, fingers we cannot see. They move the minutes as they please." Holmes turned sharply. "Where are those journals now?" "Destroyed. After Broome died, his nephew claimed the estate and burned everything. Said it was the only way to stop the ticking." A silence fell. Holmes stepped closer to the bench. "Mr. Latchley, on the night Miss Hargrove died, did you attend the gathering in Chelsea?" Latchley's lips pressed tight. "I was there the entire evening. I left at 11, he admitted. Went home. I couldn't stay my nerves. The clocks, the noise. I needed quiet." Holmes studied him closely. Then you had the opportunity. You live only 20 minutes from Belgravia. You could have reached the house, tampered with the mechanism, and vanished before the stroke of midnight. I didn't, Latchley said hoarsely. But someone else might have. Who? The one Broom feared, he whispered. The one he called the hand that interrupts. Holmes turned away without responding. He had heard enough. Outside, the wind had picked up. Holmes stood on the curb, eyes distant. He's unstable, I said, but not a liar. No, Holmes agreed. But liars often hide among the mad. He pulled out his notebook and tapped a line he had underlined 3 times. Elijah Broom set the next alignment for 1:03 a.m., he murmured. But someone wanted it rung early. Not misintercepted. Intercepted by whom? Holmes looked up at the leaden sky. That, my dear Watson, is what we must discover before the alignment returns. Chapter 6. The fragment of glass 2 mornings after our encounter with Harwin Latchley. I found Holmes already awake and dressed before sunrise. Standing by the bay window with one hand pressed to the glass, the city beyond was still submerged in fog. A spectral London of shifting outlines and faint lamplight. Without turning, do you recall the ash in the fireplace at the Hargrove residence? Of course. You retrieved the burnt scrap from it, the one bearing the word, "My Nation," indeed. A careless destruction. Yet what disturbed me most was not the paper, it was what I saw half buried beneath the grate, but left untouched. I raised a brow. You mentioned nothing of it. I wasn't sure at the time. A hunch only, but I had it retrieved yesterday, once Mr. Hargrove gave his consent. It arrived by post an hour ago. He turned and held out a small velvet pouch. I took it and appended the contents onto the desk. A single curved shard of glass fell into the light, thick and slightly clouded. Not a drinking glass, no. The curvature and weight suggested something else entirely. Holmes pointed to it. What does that remind you of? I turned it in my hand. A lens. Possibly from a watch crystal. Precisely, Holmes said. But not just any watch. This is thick enough to be a repeater, platotype used in bespoke timepieces that chime the hour on demand. Miss Hargrove kept clocks, but she also collected metronomes, barometers, and other precision instruments. And I believe someone used a device that struck time independently separate from the grandfather clock. You think this fragment came from that device? Yes, and it broke during the act, likely dropped, or perhaps destroyed in haste when its purpose was served. I studied it again. Do you believe it was used to mimic the chime? To deceive Miss Hargrove? Holmes's eyes narrowed. Or to manipulate her into believing it was the true chime? He walked to his desk and unfurled a fresh sheet of paper. Let us think clearly, Watson. We now have 3 points of deception: the letter, the bell, and the clock. Each speaks in the language of time. Someone orchestrated these elements to draw Miss Hargrove into the vestibule. But she was not merely lured. She was prepared. I looked. How so? Holmes tapped his pencil on the desk. Her reading materials, her patterns, her growing obsession with temporal instruments. Florence claimed Agatha's interest in timekeeping became sharper in recent months, even compulsive. Yes, and the housekeeper said it worsened in the autumn. Correct. Which suggests an external influence. Someone wanted her fixated on time, on the idea that time would speak. He crossed to the fireplace, where the scorched brass bell still lay in the tray beside the hearth. This bell. You recall, it had one side scorched. Yes, but there was no fire nearby. And yet the melting was sharp, directional, and abrupt. Holmes paused. What melts brass with precision without fire? I frowned. A focused flame. Or an electric arc, perhaps. Holmes nodded once. Exactly. A small burst, perhaps from a concealed mechanism, wired to strike the bell at the precise moment, then destroy itself. Sabotage. A signal. I stared at him. But who would go to such lengths merely to simulate a chime? Holmes walked back to the window, folding his hands behind his back. Because that chime wasn't just sound, Watson. It was a cue. An agreed-upon moment between two parties. A silence fell between us. He turned back abruptly. We're going to Richmond, to the Hargrove estate again. No, to the Richmond Museum of Astral Engineering. I blinked. Isn't that more an eccentric's archive than a museum? True, but among its volumes is a rare book, Chronostasis and the Living Dial, written by Benedict Avenel, the very man who built the sidereal clock. If there's anything that will explain the symbols carved into its casing and what alignment, Broom and Latchley were so consumed by it will be there. The Richmond Museum of Astral Engineering was housed in a converted observatory on a wooded hill overlooking the Thames. We arrived by noon, and Holmes, without pausing to admire the collection of astrolabes and lunar pendulums, made directly for the catalogue room. The curator, a dusty man named Forsyth, led us to a locked glass case. Within, among other volumes, yellowed by time, lay the book Holmes sought. Forsyth unlocked the case and withdrew it with reverence. Holmes turned the pages carefully. The text was dense with theories that straddled both science and mysticism, temporal corridors, celestial rhythms, and other such esoteric. But it was a folded insert near the middle that stopped him. An illustrated diagram, a rendering of a Venal's sidereal clock. Surrounding it were the familiar zodiacal markings, but one, shaped like an inverted crescent intersecting a downward triangle, had been highlighted in red ink. Holmes drew a breath. Watson, he said, this symbol appears on the Hargrove clock, but nowhere in any horological texts. What does it mean? It's not a time. It's not even a celestial body. It's a signal, a symbol for interruption. Venal called it the divergence, a hypothetical moment when normal causality is suspended. He believed a chime at that moment could open a gate between ordered time and something else. He never defined it, only wrote, "Do not chime unless the listener is prepared to be undone." A chill crept through me. And Agatha Hargrove? I asked. She was prepared, Holmes said. Prepared and placed. She waited for the chime, not knowing it was premature, meaning the gate, if such a thing existed, never opened naturally. It was forced. Why? That, Holmes said, closing the book, is what I intend to find out before the alignment returns tonight. Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes pored over his notes, adjusting the timepieces on the mantel until they aligned precisely with the sidereal hour. He set one to 1:03 a.m., another 2-3 minutes earlier. I watched him with unease. You believe the same event will be attempted again? Not attempted, Holmes replied. Completed. The first was a rehearsal. Rehearsal for what? Holmes looked at me darkly. For an appointment. One Miss Hargrove was not meant to keep alone. Chapter 7. The rehearsal repeated the evening of November 21st, pressed heavily upon Baker Street. Holmes had extinguished the lamps and drawn the blinds. Only the fire remained, casting uncertain shadows across the cluttered room. Every clock and metronome we owned had been wound and synchronized to two critical points, midnight and 1:03 a.m. Holmes had even borrowed a celestial chart from the Royal Observatory, which now lay open across the floor like the blueprint to some invisible machine. I confess, the tension had taken hold of me more than I cared to admit. There was an unspoken urgency in Holmes' movements, a quiet insistence that this night held weight beyond reason. Holmes stood by the mantel, his eyes not on the clocks, but on the silence between their ticks. "You said it was a rehearsal," I ventured. "The night Agatha died." We arrived in Holwood Green by mid-afternoon, the village a hushed and half-forgotten corner of South London. The tower itself stood behind a row of overgrown hedges, its spire crumbling, the bell chamber above open to the elements like a hollowed tooth. A rusted gate groaned as Holmes pushed it aside. Vines curled up the stonework, and moss bloomed along the cobbled path. We found the main door ajar, its hinges warped with age. Inside, dust swirled in the filtered light. Wooden pews sat askew, as if abandoned at the far end. The great bell cracked, and lichen-covered hung lifeless above a dais that once served as a lectern. He moved slowly, studying the floorboards, the pulleys overhead, the worn paths between benches. Then he stopped at a small work table, tucked behind a fallen beam. There, partially buried in dust, was a velvet glove. He lifted it gently. Dark green, embroidered initials, M.V. Do they mean anything to you? Holmes looked thoughtful. Not yet. He turned to the walls, scanning the bookshelves, and finally stopped before a narrow cabinet. Inside, behind a pane of sooty glass, stood a set of tuning forks, some broken, others intact, arranged like organs in a skeleton. Each bore an etched sigil. Holmes withdrew one and struck it gently. The sound it produced was faint, less a tone than a vibration. My vision swam for a moment, and I gripped the side of a pew to steady myself. "You felt that?" Holmes asked. "I did." Vale's notes described this phenomenon, he said. "A frequency so pure it bypasses conscious recognition." He believed such tones could be used to trigger memory, suggestion, even sleepwalking. I stared at the tuning fork, and the chime Agatha Hargrove heard may have been its cousin. Holmes returned the fork to its slot, then moved to a stack of forgotten papers beneath the table. As he flipped through them, he paused at a water-stained pamphlet titled "The Threshold of the Tone," preparing the listener. He scanned the opening lines aloud to receive the true note. One must relinquish the tyranny of linear time. The listener must be made porous-conditioned through rhythm, repetition, silence, and anticipation. When the divergence strikes, the self must be still. He lowered the page. Agatha Hargrove was the listener. "And this woman?" I asked. Holmes stepped back from the cabinet. The bell back in Baker Street. Holmes set to work as though under an invisible command. He cross-referenced birth registries, former student rolls, and property ownership ledgers. Hours passed in silence until, at last, he spoke. Here, March 5, 1875, Mariel Vale, daughter of Dr. Tertius Vale, enrolled as a student of celestial harmonics at age 16. Disappears from public record after 1897, the same year the college was abandoned, I said. Holmes nodded. The year her father died. Some believed she left for the continent, but I believe she remained, and I believe she carried her father's experiments forward. Into what? Into ritual, Holmes said grimly, and she needed a listener to complete it. I exhaled. You think she used Agatha as a conduit? Perhaps. Or a key. But in either case, the chime was meant to pass through her, and when it failed, Holmes's face darkened. Then the ritual remained unfinished. But that may change. She has the knowledge, the design, and now a second opportunity. At twilight, a note arrived. It bore no signature, only a short line penned in green ink. We rang the bell too soon. This time, let it strike true. M.V. Holmes read it aloud, then looked at me with uncharacteristic gravity. She's inviting us. To what? To the final chime. He walked to the mantel, where the clocks ticked in discord. Slowly, Holmes reached forward and stopped them all. I have followed many minds, Watson, he said, but never one tuned like this. Chapter 9. The sound that wasn't heard the following day unfolded with strange stillness. The streets of London pulsed with their usual disarcards, boots against flagstone, but within 2-1 Baker Street, it felt as though we had slipped one beat behind the city's rhythm, caught in a time no longer wholly our own. Holmes sat unmoving in his chair, staring into the hearth. Though the fire was long cold, he did not seem to notice. Before him lay Mariel Vale's note, weighted at the corners by stopped watches. She invites us to finish what she began, he said at last. I stirred in my chair. But to what end? He blinked slowly. That, Watson, is the one thing she has been careful not to reveal. I glanced toward the map. The 3 red pins: Belgravia, Soho, Holwood. Holmes had drawn new lines connecting them, forming an odd triangular symbol with the word divergence at its center. There is something I must attempt, he said, rising, but I require silence. He moved to the table and drew a cloth over his work. No interruptions, no sound, not even the clocks. I watched, puzzled, as he removed his shoes and shut the door behind him. For the next 40 minutes, there was nothing, no creak of floorboards, no rustle of paper. Even the wind seemed to halt, and then an unmistakable clang, not loud, not metallic, something subtler, like a tone struck, not in the air, but beneath it. Holmes emerged moments later, paler than when he had entered. You heard it too, he said simply. I think so, I replied, but I can't describe it. You're not meant to. That's the danger. He walked slowly to the window and looked down at the street. It wasn't produced by an instrument. It was summoned by what? Not what, Holmes corrected. Whom? That afternoon, Inspector Gregson arrived unannounced, his coat soaked with sleet and his boots leaving dark prints on the rug. I've news, he said. There was a break-in last night at the Royal Observatory Annex in Blackheath. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Unusual target, indeed, Gregson said. And stranger still, nothing appears to have been stolen. Just one display opened, a brass harmonic dial, part of their Victorian acoustics collection, removed from its case, examined, and left exactly as it was. Holmes's expression sharpened. She was testing it, measuring the fidelity of the chamber. She's choosing a location, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to Gregson. It must be precise, resonant, historically tuned, and mathematically aligned with the sidereal cycle. The observatory annex is elevated, geometrically symmetrical, and made of old limestone, perfect for acoustics, I added. Gregson frowned. Look, I don't pretend to understand this business of chimes and ghosts, Holmes, but the woman's dangerous. You've got to stop her. Oh, I intend to, Holmes said, his voice suddenly cold. But I must meet her first, I echoed. You intend to accept the invitation. I must, Holmes said. She believes she failed with Agatha Hargrove, that the ritual did not take, but she hasn't given up. She's searching for a substitute, a better listener. I stood. Holmes, you don't mean? Yes, Watson. He turned toward me with calm finality. She means me. We traveled that evening to the observatory grounds. Though the main building was closed to the public, the side annex remained unguarded, curious oversight. Or perhaps something arranged. We entered quietly, and Holmes led us down a corridor lined with glass cases and worn plaques. The air smelled of dust and ozone. This way, he said, guiding me to a circular chamber at the end. It was a perfect dome, its interior lined with curved limestone panels. In the center sat a single brass stand, likely once used for mounting instruments. Tonight it was bare. Holmes walked to the center and stood motionless. She come here, I whispered. She's already come and gone, he said. She was preparing the space, tuning it. As we waited, I noticed something strange. The longer we stood in silence, the more I became aware of a sound not quite present, a hum below hearing, like a tension in the very bones of the air. Holmes closed his eyes, and then I saw her. She did not enter through any door. Rather, she appeared as though stepping into our world from one just behind it. A tall woman in a green velvet coat, with hair as black as pitch and eyes that caught no light. Mr. Holmes, she said softly. Miss Vale. They regarded each other for a long moment. You read my father's notes, she asked. I did. Then you know what must be done. Holmes said nothing. He thought it was madness, she went on. But he was wrong. The chime is a key, not to open something, but to synchronize, to align our perception with the rhythm of what comes next. What comes next, Holmes said, is death. She tilted her head. Only to those who hear imperfectly. You, Mr. Holmes, you were born tuned. I stepped forward. You killed Agatha Hargrove. Mariel turned to me, eyes cool. I prepared her, but she was unripe. The signal passed through and met resistance. That is why she collapsed. She was not wrong only early. You used her, Holmes said flatly. I invited her, Mariel replied. As I now invite you. She reached into her coat and withdrew a small device, clockless and humming faintly. This one is pure, she said. No gears, no weights, only tone. We can strike it together. Holmes did not move. You misunderstand me, Miss Vale, he said. I am not your listener. I am your echo. And echoes fade, she blinked. And then Holmes struck the device from her hand. It shattered on the limestone with a sound like breaking water, and all at once the chamber exhaled. The pressure lifted. The hum vanished. Mariel staggered back, eyes wide with fury. "You don't know what you've done." "I know exactly," Holmes said. "You built a gate with no door. Now it is closed." She turned to Fleabit Gregson, and 2 constables were waiting at the far end of the corridor. They moved swiftly, binding her hands before she could resist as they led her away. She did not weep or scream. She simply whispered, "The rhythm will return. It always does." Later that night, Holmes and I sat in silence once more. "She was quite mad," I said, "and quite brilliant." Holmes nodded. "The most dangerous kind." I leaned forward. "And the chime. What would it have done had she succeeded?" Holmes stared at the now still metronome on the mantel. "I don't know," he said, "and I suspect that is the best outcome we could hope for." Chapter 10. The echo left behind the next morning dawned clear, almost eerily so. The fog that had so long draped itself across London's rooftops had lifted, revealing a sky of sharp winter blue. It was the sort of morning, I thought, when the world pretends it remembers nothing, when the streets carry on as if bells were never rung in secret, and no shadows stepped from the cracks between hours. Yet Holmes was not deceived by the weather's clemency. "She is not finished," he said quietly. Fingers steepled beneath his chin as he sat once more in his chair, staring into the cold grate. "Though the apparatus is destroyed and Miss Vale is in custody, something lingers." "You believe she acted with others?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that we have misunderstood the nature of her design." He rose and walked to the mantel, where the broken remains of the chime device had been laid out like the fragments of a fallen star. Small coils of wire, glass, dust, a splintered tuning disc, none more than an inch wide, and all humming with potential. "I had hoped," he went on, "that destroying the device would end the cycle, that she needed hardware to create her illusion. But now I see was not a machine she built." I frowned. "What then?" "A principle," he said. "A rhythm. One she has already set in motion." He turned to the mantel clock and adjusted the hour hand by a single minute. "Do you hear it?" he asked. I listened. "Hear what?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he crossed to the bookshelf and withdrew the volume from the Richmond Museum, the one by Benedict Avena. From between its pages, he drew forth a second sheet, one I had not seen before, a diagram circular, intricate, not unlike a clock face, but denser, layered with strange symbols that pulsed with obsessive geometry. "This," he said, "is the tuning schema for the sidereal sequence. The same Avenel used to design the chime?" "Yes, and note this corner here." He pointed to a corner of the page, where a handwritten note, presumably in Avenel's own script read, "Once the harmonic echo is sounded, its rhythm persists across the mental field. The listener continues to hear it long after the bell has faded." Holmes lowered the page. "It is not the sound that matters. It is the memory of sound." I sat back, feeling a strange cold settle along my spine. "Are you saying Agatha Hargrove didn't die from hearing the chime, but from remembering it?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "Mariel Vale may have failed to open her so-called door, but she succeeded in imprinting the rhythm into another mind. And you think she did the same to you?" Holmes met my gaze. "No, not to me." A silence stretched between us. "You mean me?" I said, incredulous. "You were with me, Watson, present in the chamber. You heard the tone twice now. The first from the tuning fork, the second from the device before I destroyed it. I don't remember hearing anything. Yet you reacted, Holmes said softly. You lost your balance. Your pulse slowed. You described the air as heavy. But I'm fine, I insisted. Nothing's happened since. Holmes placed the sheet back in the book, closed it, and rested his hand gently atop the cover. Yet these things are rarely immediate, like poison without taste. You may carry it and not know it. I stood abruptly, rattled. Then what do we do? Holmes walked slowly to the window. We find the echo. That afternoon, we returned to the Hargrove residence. Felix Hargrove greeted us with more solemnity than suspicion. His sister's death had aged him, and he moved now with the slowness of one who had begun measuring time in grief. You believe there's more to it? He asked. Yes, Holmes replied. We believe Agatha's death was the result not of what she heard, but what remained with her afterward. Felix hesitated. She did speak once, before she died. Holmes turned quickly. She spoke, only a single phrase. The maid overheard it, but didn't think to mention it at the inquest. What did she say? Felix furrowed his brow. There's someone in the clock. Holmes exhaled through his nose. That confirms it. Confirms what? That the chime did not signal an opening. It summoned something within the mind. Holmes examined the long case clock once more. With Hargrove's permission, he disassembled the rear casing, revealing its workings. The gears were clean, no hidden mechanisms. And yet, Holmes traced the inner frame with his fingers until he reached a small, unfamiliar carving behind the pendulum, a series of notches, faint but precise, etched in concentric arcs. Avenel's pattern, Holmes whispered. This wasn't just a timepiece, it was a transmitter. He stepped back, face unreadable. Watson, we must test it. Test it, I said, alarmed. We don't know what it might do. That is why you will not hear it. He removed a single component from the clock's housing and replaced it with a small harmonic crystallua, relic from Latchley's workshop. Then he wound the clock, just enough to arm the mechanism. He turned to Hargrove. Do you still have Agatha's writing? Only one page. She burned the rest. Holmes examined the Peja journal entry, dated 2 days before her death. I dream of doors that don't open, and footsteps that come from behind the walls. I hear the bell now, even when it does not ring. It has a shape. Holmes folded the page gently. She had already begun to lose herself, he said. It was not madness, but her perception was being synchronized. And once synchronized, it could not be undone, I murmured. He nodded. But what of me? I asked, quietly. Holmes looked at me with something close to sadness. That is what we must now determine, and quickly, for the next alignment is in 3 days. That night, I returned to my room above Baker Street with an unease I could not shake. I stared long at the wall, wondering if I truly felt a pressure beneath the silence. And just before I fell asleep, I thought only for a moment that I heard a single, distant chime, not loud, but inside my head. Chapter 11. The memory that ticked the following morning. I woke with the peculiar sense that I had not truly slept. My dreams, if they could be called that, were filled with faint, rhythmic impressions like footsteps muffled by centuries, or the whispering click of gears turning just out of sight. There had been no sound, yet I awoke with the certainty that something had spoken to me wordlessly. From a place beyond the veil of ordinary thought, I descended to the sitting room where Holmes already stood at the window, collar upturned, face drawn. He turned as I entered and studied me in silence. "You heard it," he said. I sat heavily in my chair. "Yes, or at least, I think I did." A chime, no, more like an echo of a chime. In the space behind waking, like the shape of a sound that hadn't yet been made. Holmes exhaled and turned back to the window. "You've entered the second phase," he murmured. I frowned. Second phase. He crossed to the mantel and retrieved the notebook in which he'd been cataloging the sequence of events. "I've been reviewing Agatha Hargrove's diary and aligning her descriptions with the sidereal calendar. Her earliest symptoms began 3 days after the first chime. Dream residue, subtle distortion of time perception, hallucinations of rhythm." He looked at me with quiet intensity. "It appears we are right on schedule." I tried to dismiss the growing sense of dread curling around my chest. "And if it continues?" "It won't," Holmes said, "because I intend to intervene before the next alignment arrives." He gestured to a bundle of letters on the desk, correspondence from the Royal Society, the Greenwich Time Service, and even a brief note from Professor Eldon Mace of Oxford's Acoustic Psychology Division. "I've been consulting every living authority on chronoperception and auditory Most dismiss the concept. One, however, believes it's plausible that an auditory archetype, a sound both imagined and remembered, could be implanted through ritual and repetition, and it can kill." I asked. Holmes was silent. He finally answered, not directly, "But the mind reacts to what it believes. If it believes that a chime signifies the arrival of something beyond understanding, it may yield." He moved to the cabinet and opened a drawer I hadn't seen him touch in months. From within, he drew a small case, flat and square, made of brass. He opened it to reveal a peculiar contraption, a black earpiece attached to a circular disc marked with concentric rings and a single red dial. "I call it the countertone." He placed it carefully on the table. "It creates a pulse in direct harmonic opposition to the chime Vale's devices were designed to produce." I leaned forward. "You built this." "I adapted it from Latchley's broken mechanism and Broom's sketches. If the chime imprints its pattern on the mind like a code, then this should be the cipher key to erase it." "And you're certain it's safe?" "I am not certain at all," he said gravely, "but I believe it is less dangerous than the alternative." We decided to test the device that evening, but Holmes insisted on one final piece of preparation. He took Munder, protest, to the basement below Baker Street, where he had long kept experimental instruments and case debris. "I need you in an isolated space," he said, "away from the city's vibrations, away from other clocks. This test must occur in complete temporal silence." The basement was cool and musty. Holmes set up the countertone device on a crate, then handed me the earpiece. "When I activate the signal," he said, "you will hear nothing, but you may feel unsettled. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Resist the pull." I obeyed. He turned the dial. At first, there was nothing, no buzz, no static. But then, a shift, a strange sensation of being unhooked, as though the very beat of my thoughts had been lifted from their moorings. My breath caught behind my eyes. I saw a figure, not Holmes, not Mariel Vale, just presence, It stood behind a door made of sound. I knew it without reason. It watched and waited and listened for the next strike of the bell. I tore the earpiece out and gasped. Holmes was beside me at once. "You saw it, didn't you?" Yes," I said, "but not with my eyes." He nodded grimly. "The imprint is deep, stronger than I feared. That wasn't a hallucination, it was the echo, still resonating. We didn't cancel it." He looked down at the device. "We amplified it." Later that night, Holmes and I sat again in the firelit stillness of our sitting room. I could feel the echo now, a thrum beneath my breath, like a second pulse beating out of rhythm with the first. Holmes was pacing. "She knew this would happen," he said. "She counted on it. The destruction of the chime, the arrested, was never the end. It was only another layer, a distraction." "You think Mariel Vale planned for you to destroy the device?" "She wanted it distributed," he replied. "Fractured, carried, planted." I stiffened. "You mean there are others?" Holmes gave a sharp nod. "Yes, not accomplices in the traditional sense, but carriers. Anyone who heard the tone, anyone affected. You, me, perhaps even Latchley. The chime wasn't a single sound, it was a virus. And she infected the air with it." He turned back to the mantel and struck every clock at once, forcing them into discordant ticking. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Creating noise," Holmes said. "Friction. Anything to prevent synchronization. If you align too closely, if you begin to expect the tone, that's when it arrives." "And the next alignment?" I asked. "It's in 2 days." Holmes turned, and in the light his face looked almost hollow. "In 2 days, Watson," he said softly, "we must not be where the chime can find us." That night, I dreamt again, but this time the figure behind the door was closer, and it knocked. Chapter 12. The daytime faltered by the morning of November 24th. The entire world seemed to move slightly out of phase. Or perhaps it was only me. Every footstep I took landed just a moment too early or too late. My reflection in the mirror seemed to hesitate before matching my movements. And only once I was certain, I saw the hands of the wall clock pause for the briefest instant, as if unsure whether to continue. Holmes noticed. "You've slipped further," he said, his tone calm but urgent. "The resonance is accelerating. The chime isn't coming for you anymore, Watson. It's already inside." I said nothing. Speaking felt difficult, like trying to form words underwater. The pressure in my mind had grown, not pain exactly, but presence. Something that was not me had taken up residence behind my eyes. Holmes had not slept. He worked feverishly, disassembling the countertone device, rearranging its components, like an alchemist frantic to stop a slow poison. Pages from Avenel's book lay scattered across the floor, marked with notes in Holmes's tight script: disruption, inversion of rhythm, auditory membrane threshold. "I must act before the alignment reaches its peak tonight," he said. "After midnight, the sidereal window closes. If we fail before then," he didn't finish the sentence. I found myself staring again at the fireplace, waiting. Holmes gripped my shoulder, startling me from the trance. "We go to the source, the clock?" I asked, my voice dry. "No, the first one. Avenel's original, the master sidereal construct. According to Greyweather's Guild, it was never sold. It remains in the old Avenel estate in Wiltshire, abandoned since 1832, I blinked. You mean to travel there? Today, he met my eyes. You've carried this long enough. If I cannot silence the echo inside your mind, I may be able to cancel it at the wellspring. At the heart of the divergence, he packed the device and a brass tuning disc in a velvet pouch, along with Avenel's diagram. Then, without further word, we departed into the cold. The Avenel estate was a crumbling stone manor, nestled deep within a grove of blackened elms, shrouded by creeping ivy and the scent of loam. The sky above had turned the color of old iron. Even the birds seemed unwilling to sing here. This is it, Holmes said softly, as the wind curled round us inside. The air was heavy and dry, despite the decay. We passed through the great hall, once grand, now warped with age. Dust lay thick across the floorboards. There were no portraits on the walls, only outlines where they had once hung, as if the house itself had forgotten who had lived within. We reached the drawing room, where the last sidereal clock remained. It stood at the far end of the room, tall and obsidian black, its surface inlaid with etched brass constellations. Unlike the Hargrove model, this one bore no numerals, only a dial that rotated slowly, silently, aligning itself with symbols that defied conventional chronology. Holmes approached it as though it might vanish if startled. "It's still moving," I whispered. "Of course it is," Holmes murmured. "It never stopped." He opened the glass face and inserted the tuning disc. Then, from his coat, he produced the reconstructed countertone device. "I am going to synchronize this mechanism, not to cancel the chime," he said, "but to resolve it, to bring it to completion. What happens then?" He looked at me, and for once there was no certainty in his expression. "I don't know." I placed a hand on the side of the clock to steady myself and drew back in shock. The wood was warm. Holmes adjusted the tuning forks, aligned them with the disc, and placed the earpiece back in my hand. "You must wear it," he said. "Only briefly. If I've calculated correctly, the echo will crest at precisely 1:03 a.m. That is when we must answer it, not with silence, but with a counter-resonance, one that closes the loop." I swallowed hard and sat before the clock. The seconds ticked by, the moment approached, and then it came. Not a sound, not precisely, but an event, a shift, like a room tilting slightly, as if time had lost its footing. My vision dimmed behind my eyes. I saw the figure again, not standing behind a door now, but stepping through. It had no face, no limbs. It was made of geometry, of sound, of ideas older than form. I felt myself rising from the chair now, being drawn upward like a thread pulled from a spool. Holmes's voice broke through the storm in my mind. "Now, Watson, now." I placed the earpiece into my ear. Holmes activated the device. There was a sudden snap, like a rope breaking, and the figure vanished all at once. The weight lifted, the pressure collapsed, and I fell back into my own body, like a man surfacing from a terrible depth. The clock stopped, dead still. Later, we stood in the doorway of the Avenel house. Dawn had begun to bleed across the fields. For the first time in days, I felt the world truly turning. "It's over," I said. Holmes didn't answer immediately. "No," he said finally. "The echo will return someday. Perhaps not in our lifetime, but someone will hear it again." He looked back at the house, then to me. "But not you." "Not now," I nodded. We said nothing more. The chime had struck, and this time it had not been heard. Chapter 13. The Man Who Didn't Forget. We returned to Baker Street that evening, the city resuming around us like a theater that had only briefly lowered its curtain. The clatter of hooves, the chiming of distant bells, the smoke rising from chimneys, it was all there as it had always been. And yet something had shifted, not outside, but within. I remember sitting in my armchair for a long while, staring at the clock on the mantel. It ticked normally. UNREMARKABLY. But there was a part of my quiet, now but not extinguished, that still listened harder than it should. Holmes sat at his desk, transcribing notes in his fine mechanical hand. His composure had returned, though I saw the lines around his eyes had deepened. "You're not well?" I said quietly. "I'm not unwell," he replied. "Merely tired." I hesitated, then added, "I think it worked. The resonance, the dreams, the pressure, it's all gone." Holmes nodded once. "Good." Then, after a pause, "You're fortunate, Watson. You let it go." "And you?" I asked. He didn't answer. "Not then." "I followed the absence," he said. I frowned. "What does that mean?" "There's a clock tower on Bellwether Street, decommissioned. No hands on its face. No bell inside." "I know it," I said. "I passed it last night," he continued. And I realized I had already passed it once that day, but couldn't recall doing so. He looked down at his hands. I climbed it, my blood chilled. "Holmes, I don't know why," he said. "Only that when I reached the platform, I found something waiting for me." "What?" He shook his head slowly. "Nothing." And that was the horror of it. We sat in silence. Then Holmes said something that unsettled me more than anything. He had said since this affair began, "I think the chime is not a sound, Watson." He looked up at me. "I think it is an instruction." That day, he sealed the tuning disc, the resonance schematic, and all notes related to Avenel, Broom, and Vale into a small, lead-lined box. He wrote only one word on the lid in India ink. "Unhere." He gave it to me. "Keep this," he said, "and do not open it. If I ever ask for it, refuse me." I stared at the box in my hands, strangely cold to the touch. "And if someone else comes asking," he met my eyes, "then you'll know the chime has struck again." Chapter 15. The final gathering. The days that followed were cold and still, as if the world held its breath. Holmes, though calm in appearance, had grown ever more distant. His thoughts seemingly folded inward. He no longer debated cases from the newspaper, nor indulged in his violin with his usual restlessness. Instead, he spent long hours rereading his own case notes, pausing often to scribble a single word in the margins. "Repeat." I could not bring myself to ask what it meant. The box remained hidden beneath the floorboards of our sitting room, sealed in its lead shell. At times, I imagined it emitted a faint sound, softer than breath, like the trailing whisper of a voice lost in a dream. But I never heard it with certainty. That, I believe, was its most insidious trick. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. There was no return address. The envelope bore a single black wax seal, a clock face without hands. Holmes opened it silently and read. His eyes lingered on the final line, then closed for a long moment. "It's time," he said at last. "For what?" I asked. "To finish what began with a chime," he murmured. He folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. "We are summoned to Hampstead tonight. An address I had hoped never to see again." "Whose address?" Holmes glanced at me. "All of them, Watson. Every one of them." We arrived just after 9. A lantern flickering above the rusted gate of number 27 Eltringham Lane Forgotten Manor nestled in the edge of Hampstead Heath, overgrown with ivy and the long memory of dust. Inside, the air was cold. No fires burned, though candles flickered along the hall like old stars in a darkening sky. And waiting within were the survivors: Marielle Vale, Inspector Gregson, Professor Elyard Brumolder, frailer than when we had last seen him in his recovered journals, but alive, and, most astonishing of all, the presence of Miriam Avenel, great-granddaughter of Joseph Avenel himself, whom we had believed long deceased. Each face was lined not only with age, but with strained men and women, marked by long listening. We gathered in the drawing-room, the walls lined with faded portraits whose eyes seemed turned toward some far and silent place. Holmes stood before them all, and for the first time in our long friendship, he looked less like a detective and more like a conductor preparing to summon a final note from an orchestra none could see. "This is the last," he said, voice low but clear. "The chime has made its final pass through those it has touched. You have all been drawn here by something you could not name. Not a sound, but the absence of one." He turned to Vale, who looked pale but lucid. "You tried to control it," he said to her, "to summon it through precision, timing, rhythm. But it cannot be summoned, only noticed. To Broom, you tried to document it, to analyze it as a mathematician might, a bell curve. But it cannot be measured, only reflected. To Gregson, you witnessed the results, the deaths, the disappearances. But you believed it to be madness. It is not madness. It is a pattern that thinks. And to Avenel, your ancestor tried to trap it in brass and pendulum, but he built a window, not a cage." The following day passed uneventfully. Scotland Yard had collected Marielle Vale from the hospital to transfer her to a secure facility. Gregson himself stopped by that morning to inform us she had spoken no further nonsense and had gone quietly. "She still claims you misunderstood her," Gregson said, sipping tea. "She said he struck the chime in the wrong key. That's why it didn't work." Holmes said nothing, but I noticed his fingers twitch against the edge of the table, as if recalling some unseen vibration. When Gregson had gone, I leaned forward. "You did strike it wrong, didn't you?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Precisely. But then, it was never resolved properly." "No," he said, "but it was contained." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folded cloth. Inside lay the small tuning disc, now cracked down the center. A soft, bluish shimmer still clung faintly to its surface, like frost refusing to melt. "This," he said, "was never just a chime. It was a key to an internal sequencer, pattern Vale believed could alter the conscious structure of the mind. I believe she was wrong about how it would do so, but not that it could." He placed the disc back in the drawer and shut it quietly. That night, I was awoken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, soft, measured. I found Holmes standing in his dressing gown, staring out the parlor window. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. "I've been thinking," he said without turning, "about Broom, about Avenel, about what they meant when they wrote of the interval that lies between. They weren't just speaking of time. They were describing a place, not in geography, he said, but in perception, the moment between seconds, the breath between thoughts. The listener does not go there, they simply stop resisting its presence. It steps in. He turned to me, eyes shadowed. Vale wasn't trying to open a door. She was trying to remove the barrier that kept the door from being noticed. A silence followed. "Holmes," I said carefully, "are you still hearing it?" "No." He looked down at his hands, "but I'm remembering it." In the days that followed, Holmes returned to his routines. The violin resurfaced. The morning papers were dissected with usual vigor. He even solved a case concerning a poisoned manuscript and a literary society feud with something close to his former enthusiasm. But I began to notice peculiarities. Once, he paused mid-sentence during a conversation and stared at the gas lamp for nearly 30 seconds, as though he had forgotten not only what he was saying but how to resume being himself another time. I found him sitting alone in the silence of the study, not reading, not thinking, listening. He would deny it, of course, when I raised the matter. He only replied, "Some chords, once struck, resonate longer than the ear can follow." Then he would say no more. The final turn came one evening in early December. Holmes had been examining a letter from a French engineer regarding a newly discovered resonance chamber in a disused opera hall. I expected some dry commentary on acoustics. Instead, he said, "Have you ever considered that the universe might remember us, Watson?" I looked up. "I beg your pardon." "I mean," he said, "that there may be impressions, echoes, if you like, not just within the mind, but within time itself, like footprints in soft stone, events that do not merely pass, but imprint. If a man could strike a sound loud enough, precise enough," he trailed off. "What would happen?" I prompted. Holmes blinked, and his expression cleared. "Nothing. Nothing at all." He smiled absently and returned to his work. But something about that smile stayed with me for a long time. Weeks passed. No new symptoms appeared. No new chimes were heard. The clocks ticked faithfully. And yet one evening, just after the fire had been laid and the windows latched high, found Holmes staring at the long case clock in the hall. "Do you hear it?" he asked me softly. I listened. "I hear nothing." Holmes nodded slowly, then whispered, "Exactly." Chapter 14. The hour that was missing. Winter crept into London with its usual gray indifference. By mid-December, frost had painted every iron railing and lamplight with brittle lace, and Baker Street bore the hush of snow not yet fallen. Most mornings passed in routine. Holmes reading by the window, I with my pen and teacup. Yet beneath that calm, I began to sense a change in him, too subtle to name. Holmes had grown careful. He no longer wound the mantel clocks at precisely the same hour. He adjusted the metronomes to irregular tempos. Once, he even moved the long case clock in the hallway 3 inches to the left, claiming it disturbed the symmetry. It was unlike him. He was a man of pattern and logic ritual, even, but now he distrusted rhythm itself. I said nothing for a time, thinking perhaps it would pass. But then something peculiar occurred. It was a Thursday early afternoon. We had returned from a brief excursion to the British Library when Holmes suddenly stopped midway through the door and frowned at the stairwell. "We're late," he said. "For what?" I asked, glancing at my watch. "We've nothing scheduled." He stared at the clock on the wall. "No, we were meant to return at 1:47, precisely. We are 4 minutes late." I raised an eyebrow. "Even by your standards, that seems a trivial detail." Holmes said nothing. Instead, he moved to the sitting room and sat down, clearly rattled. "Not by the fact of our lateness, but by its absence. I don't recall being delayed," he murmured. "We left the library on time. We walked without interruption. And yet," I sat across from him, "you think something happened in those 4 minutes?" He nodded slowly. "I don't know what, but I believe something was removed. Over the next few days, the incidents multiplied. A burned-out matchstick found on Holmes's dressing table that neither of us recalled using. A page missing from one of his journals, cleanly torn, not clumsily removed. A half-smoked cigarette in the ashtray he hadn't lit at first. I wondered if these were merely the result of fatigue or even my own imagination. But Holmes, so rarely shaken, began to pace at night again, his gaze never resting long in any one place. One evening, he confided in me. "There are intervals I cannot account for," he said, his voice measured but grim. "Waking moments I do not remember entering. Objects I find in my coat that I cannot place. Have you considered," I offered carefully, "that your own mind may be mimicking the symptoms Vale cultivated in her victims?" He nodded. "I have, but that would imply I was a victim. And I never heard the chime." "Not directly," I reminded him. "But you reconstructed it. You stood in its field. You engaged it intentionally twice." He said nothing for a long time. "Then perhaps some echoes do not require a listener." On the night of December 18th, Holmes vanished. I awoke at 2:30 in the morning to find his bed untouched. The fireplace was still faintly warm, but his coat and boots were gone. I searched the flat, then the street, then finally the alley behind our building, where I found footprints in the snow leading toward Paddington Street, then vanishing at the edge of the MEWS. No carriage had passed. No witnesses had seen him. And then, as I turned to retrace my steps, I heard a sound I had not heard in weeks. A single chime, low and far away. I froze, walking through the door with a calmness that unsettled me more than any confession might have. He removed his coat without a word and sat in his chair by the fire. "Where were you?" I asked. He looked at me with that strange stillness I had seen once or twice before when staring down a killer, or contemplating a puzzle he wished he had never solved.
I frowned. "You mean it affected the mind directly?" "Precisely," he said. "Not like hypnosis or suggestion. It created gaps in perception, interruptions in memory, time, even awareness. You experienced this yourself. The missing minutes, the forgotten walk. And Mariel Vale sought to amplify it," I said. "She misunderstood it," Holmes corrected. "Avenel did not create the chime to control others. He built it to observe the interval, to study the moment between events, the crack in time's rhythm. And that thing," I said, hesitating, "the listener?" Holmes was silent for a moment. "Some things, Watson, are not beings in the biological sense. They are phenomena, events with volition. The chime made the mind susceptible to noticing patterns that do not usually touch us. And once noticed, those patterns began to notice back." I shivered. Holmes continued. "The deaths, the so-called madness, each was a consequence of exposure. Vale tried to tune the pattern deliberately. Broom attempted to record it mathematically. Both attracted the pattern's attention. And one scene," he paused. "You cannot always become unseen." I stood and began to pace. But this meeting, the final gathering, what purpose did it serve? To end the feedback loop, Holmes said, each of us who had come in contact with the chime carried part of the pattern within, a kind of mental residue, like separate voices humming a single unfinished phrase, until we brought those voices together in harmony. He snapped his fingers. The pattern continued to search for completion. We gave it closure. We completed its arc. And destroyed it? I don't believe it can be destroyed, but it can be dismissed. Holmes walked to the window. Snow flurried beyond the pane, silent and slow. Think of it like a melody, Watson, one heard faintly in sleep. If never resolved, it will play forever. But if you reach the final note, he turned. It falls quiet. Later that day, Holmes and I returned to Scotland Yard at the request of Inspector Gregson. He led us to a small evidence chamber where items from the original investigation into Mariel Vale had been stored. Among them was a first version of the tuning disc, undamaged, still whole. I had this locked away months ago, Gregson said. But last night, the lock was broken, the room undisturbed, except for this. He held out a sheet of paper. On it, in Vale's careful hand, was written. I heard the echo again, but only once. I believe this time it will fade. Holmes studied the disc, then stepped back. Seal it, he said, and never strike it again. Where should it go? Gregson asked. Holmes replied, bury it, sink it in the Thames, grind it to dust, let it be forgotten. The inspector nodded solemnly. As we left the yard, Holmes seemed lighter, not cheerful. He was never truly cheerful, but there was a peace about him I had not seen in weeks. That evening, back at Baker Street, I found him standing before the long case clock in the hallway, the one we had heard chime only once. What are you thinking? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. That the mystery is solved. And yet, yes, some part of me wonders if it solved us. I laughed. Now that sounds dangerously philosophical. Holmes. He turned, his eyes sharp but warm. Then write it down, Watson. Let it live on paper and die there. And the box? I asked. He gave me a sidelong glance. Keep it hidden. If it hums again, you'll know what to do. I wrote long into the night, setting down every step, every clue, every silence. It was, without question, the strangest case we had ever encountered. Not a crime of passion or greed, not a murder for gain or vengeance, but a mystery born of sound, of time, of consciousness itself. In the end, there had been no villain in the traditional sense, only a pattern, a phrase incomplete, and a silence that, once understood, became a mercy. Chapter 17, The Silence That Followed. It was a Wednesday morning, clear and cold. A dusting of snow had settled over the rooftops of London, muffling the world in a hushed glow. In our sitting room at Baker Street, the fire snapped gently in the grate, and Holmes sat, as was his custom after a case, immersed in the London newspapers, not for interest, but to verify the magnitude of Scotland Yard's inevitable self-congratulation. Ah, he murmured, flipping a page with amusement. Gregson has been knighted in print. The inspector who unraveled the mystery of the Hampstead clock. What splendid fiction. I smiled. They didn't mention you at all. No, but that's the point, Holmes said. Let the chime die with anonymity. We have had enough of echoes. He reached for his pipe, then paused. Do you know what struck me most, Watson, about this affair? That it had no criminal in the usual sense? No, that it began with a lie. I raised an eyebrow. The very first chime, Watson, the one Miss Vale believed she had recreated, it never struck. Not truly. It was a psychological resonance, born of fear and expectation. The disc she designed was imperfect, but because she believed it worked, so did those who listened. The real danger was never the device. It was a suggestion of it. He tapped his temple gently. The chime rang only once, but only because someone believed it could. I was silent a moment, absorbing this. And the deaths. Holmes leaned back. The pattern that emerged afterward, the memories, the disappearances, the gaps in time, those were very real. But they weren't caused by the sound. They were caused by the belief in the sound. The human mind, Watson, is the most precise tuning fork of all. Strike it with dread, and it will vibrate for years. He stood and crossed the window, watching the light dance across Baker Street. What we defeated was not some ghost in brass, he said. It was fear, layered and passed from mind to mind, like a contagious melody. A whisper shared too often becomes a scream, even if no one hears the original voice. That afternoon, I received a letter from Mariel Vale. She had entered voluntary care. Not out of madness, she wrote, but to find quiet. I no longer hear it, she said, and if I ever do, I shall not listen. She thanked Holmes for releasing her from a prison she had built herself. I always believed the chime could command others, she wrote, but it was only ever commanding me. Holmes read the letter and folded it neatly. She was brave, he said softly, more than most. In the following weeks, the house at Eltringham Lane was sealed by the Crown and fell into further disrepair. The tuning discs were destroyed, publicly by the Yard and privately by Holmes's own hand. I watched him reduce his schematics and theories to ash. Each sheet burned deliberately, methodically. When I asked why, he said simply, because some solutions do not belong in the world. And I understood. One evening, not long after the final fire, I returned from a walk to find Holmes in his chair, violin in hand. He was playing, not a classical piece or a folk tune, but a strange, almost dissonant series of notes. Each seemed to reach toward something, then pull away. New composition? I asked. A test, he said, bow pausing midair. Just ensuring I'm the only one who hears it. He smiled faintly, then shifted to a gentle, meandering air. The room, for the first time in weeks, felt entirely ours again. No shadows in corners, no ticking doubts behind the silence. Do you ever wonder, I asked, what might have happened if we hadn't stopped it? Holmes tapped the violin softly. I don't believe we stopped anything, Watson. We simply refused to continue it. The clock rang once. We heard it, then we let it end. The story of the clock that rang only once was never published. I kept my notes, of course, each deduction, each contradiction, each flickering anomaly, but Holmes asked that I leave it untold. Not every mystery belongs in the annals of deduction, he said. Some belong in the margins, in the unstruck hour, in the moment before the chime. And so it rests there still, quiet, unsounding. But every now and then, as I walk the quieter lanes of London, I pause when I pass a clock tower long since stilled. I look up at the face with no hands and listen, not for sound, but for the absence of it. And that, I've come to learn, is how one knows it is truly over. Because if you listen closely enough, you might hear it too, the moment the world decided not to ring again.